All right. So recently I did a really quick review of a documentary I went to go see before I went to go see West Side Story called Gamestop, Rise of the Players. And since that quick review did pretty well, I wanted to do a more comprehensive review to really give my overall feelings on the subject and also talk about a little bit more about my feelings of documentaries in general and why I feel like this one didn't do as well as it could as a documentary. Okay, so GameStop, Rise of the Players tells the story of the rise and fall and rise of the GameStop stock over the course of the last couple of years, told mainly from the point of view of the early adopters of the GameStop stock and some of the people who were involved as short sellers on the other side. And then tries to depict the battle between the two of them and also be a little bit of an informative documentary on the stock market itself. Now, a lot of this is hard because the whole GameStop situation is very contentious. Many people have probably heard a little bit of how this story played out, or in some cases a lot, especially with how pervasive the GameStonk meme became. But it was really interesting to see this story told from the beginning of the whole thing before it launched. The problems with this documentary, however, mostly stem from a lack of focus, which is something I've been noticing more and more in narratives and storytelling, and I've been kind of harping on a few times, but lack of focus is a big problem. And I kind of feel like I need to explain what I mean in this particular case. Documentary storytelling has a bit of a weird balancing act that it needs to do. For me personally, I see filmmaking as one of three categories. You have narrative filmmaking. That's your traditional movie. It's telling a story from front to back. That story can be true, it can be fictional, but either way, the primary focus of the film is to tell a story, to be entertaining, to be captivating, but being informational is secondary. On the other end of the spectrum, you have journalism. Now, what I'm thinking of mainly is stuff like 60-minute editorials, nightly news, and in some cases, like some much more basic, dry documentary filmmaking. The primary focus is to be informative. It has a story, it has an arc that they're trying to tell, but the general idea is that you're being informative first. And then in the middle, you have documentary filmmaking, which means you have something that's trying to be informative while also telling a very good story at the same time. A good documentary does both of those things very well. It gives you all the information you could possibly need about the subject while also telling you that information in a way that it is entertaining and fun to watch, or at least interesting to watch, complete with twists and turns, etc. There have definitely been some really good examples of that in recent years, although some of them have later come out you can see some of the holes in where they decided to cut their stories and the information they decided to leave out to tell their narrative. Big examples being like Making a Murderer or Tiger King. And there are also some really good ones to see how different people would approach the same subject, like the competing Fire Festival documentaries. All well-made documentaries, but all had kind of different approaches to it. Or even just I forget what the series it was coming out of, but the Save Britney documentary, also incredibly well done. The problem with this one is that it can't tell where it wants to put its focus in the story and where they want to put their information. So the movie is 1.5 hours long, but feels simultaneously too long or too short. It felt like there was so much information in it that the documentary got bogged down, but simultaneously they didn't give enough information in any particular category to really feel fully informed on the subject. Part of this is because the documentary follows 9 people to start with who are various members of a group that was the initial, like, we're going to invest in GameStop because clearly this is being shorted, clearly somebody is undervaluing this organization. And this is multiple people from a small-time YouTuber who is now a bigger-time YouTuber to a private investor, to a small town investment broker, to a couple who is living in a van and traveling while they're working remotely. A whole big cast of people. Also, very notably, although he wasn't interviewed for the film, Roaring Kitty, who was a streamer streaming his looking over the stock market. So seeing that group start is really, really interesting. But then, as the narrative goes along, they focus more and more on the GameStop end of things. Where the company is moving, and then it shifts gears again and focuses mostly on the stocks. And then it focuses on the short selling. So the problem is, every time it shifts the narrative, you feel like one of the stories is getting left in the dust. For instance, they introduce all these different people, but then only give you just enough information to know why they got into it, and then a little bit as it goes along of a couple of people get to know when they jumped off. Very few of them actually get like a full, real arc through the movie, which normally wouldn't be an issue, but because they're trying to tell those stories in tandem with the other story, the fact that we don't get enough of them feels weird. The focus was too far off of those people to really get a full idea of who they were, which normally wouldn't be an issue if they were just experts that were trying to talk about the subject and not people who were directly involved with the story. I feel like I didn't get enough of them and how they actually fit in with everything going on, considering they were so directly involved. On the other end of it, it feels like they're giving you just enough information to not feel like you're lost while they're telling you about the stock market fluctuations and why those fluctuations are happening and talking about what short selling is and all that, but not enough at the same time. They don't get into the grittiness of it that would really feel like you're really learning something about the stock market, which, and maybe that's just a personal preference, but who knows. And then they get into talking about the short sellers and what was happening on that end, and talking about the Robinhood situation and the Citadel Capital, but then never really get quite deep enough to that to really feel like they were telling you a good story. It was more just to add a couple of extra things in. We're going to talk about this point and then we're going to move on. Instead of, it felt like it needed more. And then the last one being, then at the end, the problem with it is that the story ends when GameStop is at a high, which does complete the narrative that they were telling. Like this, the documentary is totally competent. It tells the narrative from front to back. The problem with it is, it felt like part one. I mean, especially as somebody who followed it a little bit enough to know that ultimately it hasn't gone to the moon and it's not looking like it's going to. You know, it could, but there are questions involved with that. That, and there are other elements where they just didn't tell you enough about GameStop to really give you an idea of why these people loved it so much or why people thought it was going to turn around. Like, they just kept saying that, yeah, it's going to turn around and this person's going to come in and they're going to turn it around. And then they introduce a new CEO that, from what I'm feeling like, a lot of people are very confident in, but doesn't really tell you what he's doing. Like, by the end of it, it's just like, oh, we're just confident he's going to do the job and he's going to fix it. And I'm like, cool. What information do you have that makes you think that? I want to know what that is. So the documentary just, even if it does tell a complete narrative, it leaves a lot of threads open at the end. There are a lot of things to love about this documentary, though. It's got pretty slick production. They have a bunch of really, really great pixelated art versions of people going about their business, and all the major players, like, they turn them into pixel art versions of themselves and show them, you know, at their screens doing their work, and it's got a lot of nice flourishes like that. Everybody's entertaining to watch. Following the narrative of Roaring Kitty was also really, really interesting, and seeing the bits that they showed from his congressional hearing was also great. This also brings me to one of my other big problems with the movie, and that is that it moves a little bit into the too biased category. Another big problem with documentaries is because they're trying to be informational, but they're also trying to tell a narrative, every documentary is going to be inherently biased. There is no way that they can't be. The problem is when it's too much in one direction or the other, or they try too hard to push the narrative they're pushing. Now, granted, I don't like short sellers. I don't like Robinhood. I don't like a lot of those guys either. But because they're telling the story they are, it felt like they were going above and beyond to make the non-GameStop people look as foolish or malicious as possible. Like it's one thing that it's like, yeah, we came in because this is what it looks like, and instead it felt like they were specifically cutting around them to make them look as bad as possible. The editing feels very, very forced in that perspective. The editing feels very, very deliberate. It feels like they're leaving stuff out on purpose. But in the end, like, I get why they're taking the perspective they did. My only problem comes with some of the actions that they hold up as the, cool, we got the short sellers. Also is like, but you're doing kind of the same shady stuff that other people are doing. Or it also kind of leaves out that all the people who were pushing for the GameStop stock to be up as much as possible and really trying to get people on, and then dumped out. There was a lot of pumping and dumping that went with this. There was a lot of attempts at pumping this as much as it could so people could dump and jump out it whenever they could. Like, there is a twist where you find out one of the people is also like this big mysterious person on the message boards. The way they presented it was like, wow, that's so cool, and I'm watching it going, that sounds like pump and dump. That sounds sketchy as shit. But once again, that is only my personal perspective as somebody who was just on the outside and is not personally invested in the GameStop story. I do want to make that perfectly clear. But yeah, that's a lot of what I have to say. It is a serviceable documentary, but you really don't need to go out of your way for it. While it does tell a whole story, it feels very incomplete, feels a little bit too biased. Yeah, it was something where I didn't feel like I got a full meal out of it. I just felt like I was eating a bunch of sides, which, you know, can be satisfying, but you don't really feel full at the end. So I guess that's pretty much what I have to say about it. You don't really need to go out of your way to see it in theaters, but it was fun. It had some nice flourishes. It was nice to see how this whole thing started. Like, that was the one thing, like, I don't think most people know is the elements where this story started. It is worth looking at if you're a big GameStop person who doesn't know that origin story. It is worth checking it out for that. It needed to be more. It either needed to be like a 4-hour miniseries, or it needed to be a 1-hour, let's run over this quick, let's talk about let's get all the big players, let's just talk about the stock and what happened and why it happened. Maybe get a little more information on the short seller market, stuff like that. Ultimately, it's not a big recommendation. Maybe check it out when it comes on to streaming services, but no need to go see it in theaters. That being said, my name is James, and I've been arguing semantics.